Good evening, everyone. I hope that all are enjoying these cold spring days in London. And welcome to the Courtauld Research Forum events for what I am certain will be a fantastic lecture by my colleague at the Department of Art History at Rice University, Dr. Farshid Emami. We are thrilled to welcome him and indeed to welcome you to this event tonight. I would like to start by introducing Farshid briefly, pass the baton, so to speak, to him to start his presentation. There will be a chance at the end for your questions that you can type in the chat box, and I will pose them to Farshid and we will have a discussion. And I hope that everyone will be engaged in this conversation. The subject is magnificent. As perhaps some of you know, I'm also an Isfahan specialist. This has been my career, actually, my research career. And I teach at the Courtauld on the arts of the early modern period in Iran in particular. And I share a great deal of interest in what Farshid does. And one of the reasons for, or the trigger for this lecture is Farshid's book, which has just come out. I'll show you, it's absolutely marvelous book, which has been produced beautifully by the Penn State University Press. It's the kind of feel of a book that an architectural historian dies for. So congratulations to you, Farshid.
Thank you.
And it's not just the look of the book, it's also the content of the book. Magnificent drawings, sketches, photographs, discussions, and his own visual and technical drawings as interpretive material about the subject. The book is titled Isfahan, Architecture and Urban Experience in Early Modern Iran. It's really hot off the oven, as it turns out. And indeed, perhaps the sort of most sustained work that Farshid has put out. Partly, I'm sure, partly coming out of his dissertation, which was written for his PhD at Harvard University, where he received his PhD in 2017. He's also trained as an architect at MIT, University of Tehran, and Beheshti University, both in Tehran, and has written articles which are not only about architecture and not only about Safavid Iran and Safavid Isfahan in particular, but also on contemporary or modern and contemporary architecture of Iran, especially in Tehran, as well as contributions to exhibition catalogs, including on lithographic imagery in an exhibition catalog called Technologies of the Image, Art in 19th Century Iran. I'd like Farshid to be allowed to invite you to give your talk, which we all are very much looking forward to, and we will have a chance to talk about your presentation afterwards. So please, it's yours.
Thank you so much, Susan, for the very generous and kind introduction, and also thank you for the invitation. I very much appreciate it. Isfahan is dear to my heart. It has been dear to you, and well, I mean, we are obviously, any new work is building upon what has been done before, and that's also the case. of my book. So hopefully we're going to see a resurgence of Isfahan studies again. And it seems that with new approaches, new materials, there is a lot to be said. I mean, there should be 100 books on Isfahan. It's like Rome or like any other major cities in the world, and it deserves to have to be studied in several publications.
Yes.
So with that, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna share my screen. In his travel narrative, the Roman nobleman Pietro della Valle relates that on June 26, 1619, his Nestorian Christian wife was invited to join Safavid royal ladies and Isfahan's noble women for an all-female excursion on the city's grand promenade, the Chaharbagh. On Wednesdays, he noted, the promenade was used exclusively by women, who would amble and amuse themselves past midnight. De la Valle's narrative is corroborated by Yazdi, the court astronomer, who recounts that beginning in 1609, on Wednesdays, the Chaharbagh was reserved for women alone. According to Yazdi, this weekly urban ritual was ordained by Shah Abbas, who allegedly worried that women were, quote, deprived of a strolling, sayr, and conversing, sohbat, on the Chaharbagh, unquote. On such days, men were barred from entering the area, and only female vendors were allowed in. To the women who strolled its tree-lined walkways, the Chaharbagh offered a multitude of sensual pleasures. During the sweltering summer days and nights of Isfahan, its leafy trees, pools, and streams created a pleasant environment, while its coffeehouses and taverns furnished additional delights, drinks to stimulate or inebriate the senses, venues where one could linger and converse. Monumental and verdant, yet intricately planned and ornamented, the Chaharbagh spawned manifold urban experiences by engaging its visitors in a carefully choreographed array of sensory, social, and aesthetic pleasures. Yet the Chaharbagh did not merely contain natural elements. The promenade was lined by monumental, ornate edifices that were built at the main entrances to the adjoining gardens. A reconstruction of the promenade's spatial configuration and architectural component, its now vanished pavilions, Sufi convents, and drinking establishments, is thus essential to appreciation of its variegated functions. Drawing on historical visual renderings, especially old photographs, Persian poetic descriptions, European travel narratives, and on-site fieldwork, in this presentation, I recreate the senses and experiences of the Chaharbagh. My aim is neither to conduct a formal analysis nor to establish a taxonomy of gardens and pavilions. Rather, I seek to uncover the holistic experience of the Chaharbagh and intimate its phenomenological character. More specifically, I strive to reimagine and expound the promenade's embodied optical experience, that is, the ways in which architectural and landscape elements were designed and arrayed to stage, frame, and enact various modes of vision in a dynamic social environment. My presentation is extracted from chapter 5 of my recently published book, Isfahan, Architecture and Urban Experience in Early Modern Iran. Across 9 chapters divided into 3 parts, the book examines the ways in which early modern Isfahan spawned new urban experiences and engendered novel manners of perceiving and imagining the city. In so doing, I mainly draw on an understudied corpus of literary descriptions, works in prose and verse that reveal an emic, ground-up view of Isfahan. I take the reader on journeys through Isfahan's markets, promenades, plazas, gardens, and coffeehouses, bringing to life the intertwined urban and social landscapes that animated the lives of the urban dwellers and shaped their perceptions of themselves, the city, and the world. Although Isfahan had been a thriving urban settlement since early medieval times, it was the massive building campaigns instigated by the Safavid ruler Chaharbagh I that set the stage for these urban experiences. Ascending the Safavid throne during a tumultuous period, Chaharbagh transferred the capital from Qazvin to Isfahan in the 1590s and embarked on extensive building campaigns in and around the city. A major component of this massive urban transformation was the Maidan-e-Nakhsh Jahan, image of the world square, bordered by commercial arcades, religious foundations, and imperial monuments. This immense urban plaza functioned as Isfahan's new civic center, hosting communal ceremonies, equestrian sports such as polo, and the daily lives of the city's inhabitants. The construction of the Maidan-e-Nakhsh Jahan was part of a broader urban plan for developing the commercial infrastructure of the Safavid capital. Previously, the civic heart of Isfahan lay in the vicinity of the Old Friday Mosque, Masjid-e-Jame, located at the heart of the walled city. Under Shah Abbas, the new Maidan was developed adjacent to the Nakhsh Jahan Garden, which was redesigned to serve as the palace complex for Dolat Khane. The renovation and construction of the covered market running between the old and new centers of Isfahan, what is today known as the Grand Bazaar, was also an integral part of urban design. The creation of a new mercantile hub in the Maidan-e-Nakhsh Jahan incited further commercial development along the artery that linked the new plaza to the old city center. Safavid building activities in Isfahan, though, were primarily focused on the area that lay outside the walled city, on the banks of the Zayander River, extending for about 4 kilometers between the palace complex and the Hazar Jarib Royal Garden in the southern foothills of Isfahan. The Chaharbagh was the central spine of these extramural urban developments. The Abbasabad corridor was inhabited by long-distance traders and skilled artisans who hailed from the city of Tabriz in Azerbaijan. New Julfa was home to a community of Armenian Christian merchants who were involved in international silk trade and were forcibly relocated to Isfahan from their homeland on the southern fringe of the Caucasus. And the corridor that lay next to New Julfa, across from the Charbagh, was inhabited by Zoroastrians. In his account of the construction of Isfahan, written in 1617, the chronicler Junabadi notes that now they call the former Isfahan the Old City, Shahr-e-Kohne, and the recently developed districts and residences the New City, Shahr-e-No. An old city fixed in the past was engendered along with the new Isfahan. The urban quarters were unified by a grand cross-axial plan formed by the intersection of the Chaharbagh and the Zayander River. The Allahverdi Khan Bridge, or also known as Siosepol, a bridge of 33 arches, linked the two sections of the Chaharbagh, while also creating a civic landmark that marked the center of the four-quartered city. As the centerpiece of this grand urban design project, the Chaharbagh presented and embodied a panoptic imperial gaze. The construction of this massive ensemble of gardens, tree-lined avenues, and residential corridors had required a considerable amount of planning and coordination. The sheer monumentality of this immense urban landscape conveyed the notion of dominance over the natural world. This was undoubtedly a key message that the project in its entirety was intended to express. But an orthogonal projection, such as the plan reproduced here on the screen, is an abstract portrayal that reduces a three-dimensional, multi-sensorial spatial reality to a flat assemblage of lines. As D. Fairchild Ruggles remarks with respect to the tomb complex of the Mughal Emperor Humayun, quote, two-dimensional representations assume that the viewer is external to the system and that the system consists of the patron, his agendas, and the stylistic genealogy of the building, unquote. It is through a consideration of the optical perception of the viewer, Ruggles notes, that, quote, the garden system can be analyzed as an expression of sovereignty and dominance. In the case of the charbagh, the analysis of the spectator's perception has broader social implications, for it was neither an enclosed estate like Humayun's funerary garden, nor a secluded imperial garden. Rather, it was a public promenade that served as the backbone of an urban system. In the charbagh, visual encounters were intimately intertwined with the social experiences and day-to-day deeds of the city's inhabitants, who assumed the roles of onlookers and participants alike in an ongoing urban spectacle. In the charbagh, vision was made palpable through various architectural devices. As a linear space, though, the promenade was apprehended primarily by a mobile observer. Continuous kinetic perception was more central to one's experience than the static viewing of a singular vista from a fixed stance. In the rest of the presentation, I will take you through the promenade, beginning in north and ending at the Hazar Jarib garden. On entering the Chaharbagh, one would have encountered the pavilion known as the Jahan-nama, meaning world displaying or world revealing. 19th century photographs depict the Jahan-nama as a cubical three-story structure pierced with multiple balconies and windows on all sides. A common epithet for palaces in Persianate architecture, the term Jahan-nama refers to the legendary cup of the mythical king Jamshid, who could observe the world in his world-revealing goblet, Jam-e Jahan-nama. The Jahan-nama was not a freestanding structure. As is evident in the photographs, a row of arched recesses adjoined the building on its western side. This arcade contained what the sources refer to as the Dowlat Gate, which was a major entrance of the walled city. The French traveler Jean Chardin notes that on the opposite side of the Jahan-nama, there was another gate that led to the living quarters of the palace complex and was used solely by, quote, women and eunuchs of the harem and the king, unquote. These and other accounts suggest that the Jahan-nama was flanked by two U-shaped recesses. One served as the public entrance into the Chaharbagh, while the other provided direct access to the palace complex. The Jahan-nama also engaged its users and viewers through its elaborate figural tile panels, which once graced its upper floor rooms and are now scattered in museums in Western Europe and North America. Archival, stylistic, and photographic evidence suggests that the tile panels now kept at the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Louvre, and the Metropolitan Museum were once installed at the Jahan-nama, which was demolished in the late 19th century. Old photographs also reveal that an intricate panel executed in polychrome glazed tiles was mounted in the arch spandrels of the central bay on the western facade of the Jahan-nama, adjacent to the Dowlat Gate. The tile panel, which measured around 5.5 meters in length, consisted of two mirrored scenes showing elegantly garbed female and male figures in a verdant setting. The key motif of the panel rendered in the upper corners shows a kneeling man in European costume offering a piece of cloth to a woman reclining on cushions. The same imagery appears in a panel now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that was once installed in the upper floor halls of the Jahan-nama. A set of tile fragments, including the one representing a cupbearer holding a long-necked bottle, also belong to the panel pictured in old photographs. And there are other fragments now at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, and another tile at the British Museum. The placement of this panel at the Charbagh's gate is emblematic of the ubiquity and visibility of sensuous figural imagery in the public spaces of Safavid Isfahan. Here, as in many other examples, the figural scene did not embellish a secluded royal pavilion, but was deliberately placed at the public entrance to the city's grand promenade. And here is a reconstruction. And if you can see in the view, there is a figure who has just entered through the Dolat gate and sort of looking up. And that gives you a sense of how this would have been viewed by a pedestrian at the time in the 17th century. Depicting paragons of male and female beauty in a garden setting, this tile panel visualized the Charbagh's atmosphere as an earthly paradise, evoking the Quranic description of the heavenly garden filled with houris and youthful servers. To the leisured class of Isfahan, however, the elegant women depicted in the panel represented, first and foremost, the city's courtesans, who amble through the Charbagh, while the youthful male figures evoke the coffee and wine servers that one would have encountered at the Charbagh's drinking establishments, just a short walk south of the Jahan-nama. As one set foot in the promenade, the panel induced a leisurely mood in its beholders, a lyrical eroticism couched in a metaphor of the heavenly garden. After dealing with the Jahan-nama, contemporary descriptions of the Chaharbagh turn to its landscape elements. Beginning at the small square basin that lay directly in front of the pavilion, they follow the stream of water in the channel that ran down the central walkway. The tree-lined central walkway is evident in a photograph on the right top corner that captures the view of the Charbagh from the upper floor hall of the Jahan-nama. The photograph represents the Charbagh from a vantage point, an uninterrupted vista that emanates from a royal pavilion and evokes a dominant gaze. Although from an elevated standpoint, the Charbagh appeared as a unified space, the beholder proceeding on foot would have had a more variegated sensorial experience. After a stride in the shade of the foliage, one would reach a bright space dominated by an enormous octagonal pool. A visitor who glanced northward at this point could see a distant view of the Jahan-nama, as is evident in another old photograph. The sketch made by the German traveler Engelbert Kampfer in the 1680s on the right conveys a similar sense of the perceptual composition of the Chaharbagh's north view. The arch of the pavilion's upper Iwan echoes the shape of the tree's branches, framing the revealing eye of the building. The site of the Charbagh's tree-lined walkway also figures in Wahid Qazvini's poetic description of the promenade. The poet takes his reader to the Chaharbagh in the autumn, when the green leaves of the chinar trees turned amber, yellow, and red, floating in the air and tumbling on the ground. With the injunction, "Behold the plane trees arrayed on both sides," Qazvini sets up his portrayal of the Chaharbagh. Yet one is not to become absorbed in this initiatory verse, matla, the poet adds, for every hemistich, misra of it is salient. The promenade is clearly likened to a poem, its rhythmic composition compared to the rhymes and meters that modulate a work of verse. The rhythmic configuration of pools and pavilions in the charbagh is recorded in drawings by Kampfer and another one by the French architect Pascal Coste, who visited Isfahan in 1840. Coste's plan also depicts the 4 rows of plane trees that were planted at regular intervals along the edges of the charbagh's sunken flower beds. These 4 rows of trees define the 3 walkways of the Chaharbagh, containing the watercourse, the central watercourse punctuated by pools and cascades. The central lane was intended for leisurely strolls, while the 2 side walkways were used primarily by those who wished to go about their business, whether on foot or on horseback. And here in these 2 paintings, 2 drawings, you can see the Jahan-nama and then the pools of different shapes that were arrayed along the charbagh. Mapping cartographic, photographic, and archaeological evidence onto a present-day plan of the charbagh reveals a fuller picture of its configuration. Stretching from the Jahan-nama to the Zayanda River, the northern portion of the promenade, approximately 1,230 meters long and 48 meters wide, was clearly laid out as a geometrically planned garden. It is not only composed of garden elements such as flower beds, pools, and cascades, but also symmetrically arranged on both axes, as in a classical quadripartite garden, the charbagh configuration of a garden that has been elongated here. This reconstruction plan also reveals the sequential experience of the charbagh, characterized by a rhythmic alternation between tree-lined walks and nodal spaces composed of a pool and 2 facing pavilions. The central walkway, as I mentioned, was intended for strolling, while the nodes were places of repose and social interaction, sort of seir and sohbat that was highlighted in the quotation attributed to Shah Abbas. Each node along the Chaharbagh offered a new sensation, allowing visitors to engage in a range of sensual and social experiences. Arranged in front of the Jahan-nama and adjoining the palace complex, the 4 gardens on the north side served as royal pavilions. The heart of the promenade, meanwhile, was dedicated to coffee houses and at least 1 wine tavern. Further south lay a pair of Sufi convents and the gardens abutting the river served as menageries of wild animals and exotic birds. Reaching the river, one could step onto the Allahverdi Khan bridge, which led to the southern portion of the Chaharbagh. As their names and setting indicate, the 4 gardens that stood on the northern side of the Chaharbagh were associated with royalty. The tent, charbagh, and the throne, takht, were long established insignia of imperial power. On the Chaharbagh, the tent and throne gardens were paired in a lyrical move with the sweet-smelling and nightingale gardens. These estates likely contained the olfactory and oral delights suggested by their names. In any event, the naming alone would have sufficed to evoke these sensations. And it's just important to note that all these gardens and pavilions have almost disappeared. So we have the drawings by Kampfer, old photographs, and a meager physical remains to reconstruct their layout, which has been the basis of my reconstruction here. The tent or Chaharbagh garden was named after the enormous big round tent that stood at its center. But the principal structure of the tent garden was the pavilion raised at its entrance along the Chaharbagh. This building is one of the few components of the charbagh that has partially survived, offering a glimpse into the intricate interior design of the promenade's lost edifices. The pavilion also contained likely stores offering sweetmeats and food to the public. The Nightingale Garden was probably named after the songbirds bred and lodged there. A court official known as Andalibchi Bashi was in charge of nightingales and other songbirds in later Safavid times. The chirping of birds above the grounds of the Nightingale Garden would have created a distinct soundscape in this area of the Chaharbagh. The Nightingale Garden is better known today, however, for the Hasht Behesht or Eight Paradises Pavilion, which was constructed later in 1669 under Shah Suleiman. Yet originally, the garden's main and only edifice was its now lost gatehouse, whose garden facade, sketched by Camphor, matches the edifice depicted in the background of Coast's engraving of the Hasht Behesht. Originally, there was no masonry structure within most of the gardens that bordered the charbagh, while retaining a degree of their literal function as entryways to gardens. The charbagh's bordering structures took on a wide range of new functions. Socially and structurally, these edifices belonged to the charbagh rather than the gardens that lay behind them. Heading south from the pool that lay between the Nightingale and Throne Gardens, one would reach an area where coffee houses and at least one tavern was located. Today, this portion of the Chaharbagh is dominated by a madrasa or religious seminary complex, which was erected in the early 18th century under the last effective ruler of the Safavid dynasty, Shah Sultan Hussein. So the madrasa dates almost a century after the original building of the Chaharbagh under Shah Abbas. But the structure that is incorporated into the madrasa's northeastern corner, and it was surveyed by Coast and functioned as a coffee house up until the early 20th century, seems to have been a remnant of four drinking houses that were constructed here in the heart of the northern section of the Chaharbagh as part of its original building program under Shah Abbas. And this is mainly based on the drawing by Camphor from 1680s, which dates from before the construction of the madrasa, and also a number of textual descriptions. So based on all these maps and textual evidence, it seems that originally, before the construction of the madrasa, here there were two pairs of pavilions that functioned as drinking establishments, coffee houses, and a tavern. And we know about this tavern because in a tazkara, which is a biographical compilation of poets of poets and their sample works. There's one by Ohadi in which he refers to a certain person named Baba Shams Tishi of Shiraz. And in this biographical notice, the author knows that Baba Shams Tishi was obviously from Shiraz, and he came to Isfahan, and Shah Abbas had a wine tavern built for him on the Charbagh. And another source talks about the wine tavern being located adjacent to a coffee house. So based on these, it seems that at least in the early 17th century, there was one operating wine tavern on the Chaharbagh. Shams is also said to have hired good-looking boys as coffee and wine servers and composed songs with lyrics of his own in praise of them. So these youthful male coffee and wine servers, which are commonly depicted in Safavid paintings, seems to have been inspired by the social milieu of these coffee houses, like these two ones by painter Reza Abbasi, who was the most famous painter of the time. And I feel that they are representations of the same figure. So these are not entirely realistic, but also conveying a sense of an individual person that has been turned into an object of desire. And on the right-hand side, we see the same server serving coffee with a tray, and there's a coffee pot on the ground, while on the left-hand side, there's a long-necked wine bottle and a cup, which are held by the figure. The still standing structure that was incorporated into the madrasa, which was either reconstructed based on the earlier structure that existed there from the time of Shah Abbas, or is it the same edifice that was incorporated into the madrasa? This offers a clearer sense of the original layout of 17th century coffee houses of the Chaharbagh. It consists of a building that looks over a square platform, which served as a kind of outdoor sitting area for the clients of the coffee house. The coffee house itself measures 13 by 10 meters on perimeter and consists of a double height domed space, square in plan, surrounded by recesses on three sides. There's a staircase that in the corner that provides access to a U-shaped gallery on the upper floor, overlooking the central hall of the coffee house and offering screened views of the landscape outside. To the south of the drinking houses was another square pool flanked by a pair of edifices. These buildings and their adjoining gardens were dedicated to two Sufi orders, the Haydariya and Nematullahi. The Haydariya was an order of antinomian dervishes, which were known as Qalandar. These were mendicant, itinerant Sufis who shunned social and religious customs. Since the 13th century, some of these deviant Sufis had been organized into orders such as the Haydariya. By contrast, the Nematullahi order, which had been established by the famous mystic Shah Nematullah Wali, represented an institutionalized form of Sufism. What united the two orders that were housed on the Charbagh was their denominational adherence to Twelver Shiism, which turned them into Safavid sectarian allies, as well as tools of a state agenda of converting the masses into the imperial creed. The sole source of information that we have on the architectural form of these convents is an old photograph. It is labeled as Qasr Shirkhane, a Lionhouse Palace, but a careful study of other old photographs shows that it actually represents one of the original convents that were built under Shah Abbas I, and is sort of mislabeled here. Facing each other across the Chaharbagh, the two Sufi convents were monumental structures built in the idiom of nearby royal pavilions. Their construction suggests that the promulgation of Shi'i orthodoxy in the age of Shah Abbas I was accompanied by a comparable level of support for devotional practices deemed deviant or transgressive by the religious establishment. The two convents of the Chaharbagh were loci of pious ritual that revolved around icons, relics, and popular rites of Shiism. The presence of the Sufis kept the promenade active around the clock. Day and night, they were seen garbed in woolen cloaks, half naked, inebriated, lounging around the pools or on the balconies of the convents, praying, slumbering, drinking, and smoking. It was indeed the presence of dervishes in urban spaces of Isfahan, such as the Chaharbagh, that made them a favorite subject of single-page paintings in Safavid times. Young and old dervishes of various persuasions, distinguished by their differing headgear and garments, were a fixture of the charbagh, suggesting that such paintings were inspired by the urban scene of Isfahan. Flowing past the drinking establishment, dervish convents, and animal houses, the Charbagh's axial stream poured into a small square basin. Here, bordering the river, were the aviary and menagerie, and beyond that, one could step onto the Allahverdi Khan bridge. The traffic roundabout presently at the north end of the bridge makes it appear like a detached, standalone monument. In its original setting, however, it was fully integrated into the spatial sequence of the Chaharbagh. The stone-paved walkway that ran the entire length of the promenade passed across the bridge, seamlessly linking the promenade's two sections. Yet the Allahverdi Khan Bridge offers more than a mere passage across the river. Composed of multiple galleries arranged in 3 levels, it engenders a range of visual and tactile encounters with the river at different scales. The play on views begins upon stepping onto the bridge. First, one encounters a longitudinal passage open to the sky and bordered by blind arches. Only after proceeding forward does one notice the open arches. Set at the intervals of 5 bays, these openings link the central passageway to the flanking arcaded galleries overlooking the river. Here, the circumscribed visual field of the promenade was inverted, incorporating the vista of the riverscape into its sequential visual experience. Moreover, through embedded staircases, one could descend to the lower level, where people could gather in the chambers carved into the piers. Here, when the water level subsided in summertime, quote, people could find refuge from the exhausting heat of the sun and take pleasure in the breeze which wafts from the surface of water, unquote, as the chronicler Jahan-nama notes. In the lower level gallery, the ocular encounter with the river yielded to an intimate tactile experience. The feeling of moist air on the skin, the chilling sensation of immersing one's feet in water. In a modular structure attuned to natural cycles, the Allahverdi Khan Bridge accommodated both visual, panoramic, and framed, and tactile engagements with the river. At the same time, those who observed the bridge from the riverbank perceived it as a colossal monument stretching across the river. Ghazvini thus likens the bridge to a dragon sleeping in the midst of the charbagh, a simile that captures the positive form of the bridge as a massive masonry edifice. If the intricate architecture of the bridge rendered it a site of social and sensory experiences, its sheer size and nodal position turned it into an iconic monument of the Safavid capital. At the south end of the bridge, a ramp descended onto the riverbank, where the vista of the tree-lined promenade, punctuated by pillared edifices, reappeared before the pedestrians' eyes. The massive pool that lay at a short distance from the bridge marked the first node of the South Charbagh. 2 monumental edifices flanked it. The pavilion to the west led to the Barbary or Zeresh garden, while its counterpart marked the entrance to the garden of the Grand Vizier. Compared with its counterpart across the river, the southern section of the Chaharbagh was marked by a stricter sense of symmetry and regularity. Camphor's plan records the layout of the gardens along with the titles of the state officials after whom the gardens were named. Unlike the promenade's northern section, which housed an elaborate social program, the gardens that bordered the southern portion of the charbagh were dedicated to bureaucratic and military elites, who each built a pavilion and a garden according to their own taste. Yet the gardens and pavilions of the southern charbagh were as elaborate and monumental as those of the northern section. A clearer picture of one of these pavilions can be seen in a photograph on the screen. Carved with recessed arches and balconies, the pavilion's facade consists of two identical blocks that project out to form a recess in front of the entrance. The deep articulation of the facade bestows a sense of grandeur on the monument. The visual appeal of the edifice arises from its clear geometric lines, the harmonious disposition of similar units, and the proportional module-based relation between larger and smaller components. During ceremonial processions, the upper floor balconies of these pavilions were likely filled with spectators keen on catching a glimpse of the pageantry. Decked out in colorful textiles, the balconied facades of the charbagh's pavilions magnified their visual presence, creating theatrical stages for observing and participating in spectacles. The array of paired pavilions culminated in the massive entrance portal of the Hazar Jarib garden, which is depicted in these two engravings made by the Dutch painter and traveler Cornelius de Bruyn, who visited Isfahan in 1704. Here, beyond the square pool, two terraces led up to an elevated forecourt dominated by a colossal Avon and enclosed by arcades on the sides. With its monumental Avon, the gateway of the Hazar Jarib struck a grandiose visual finale for the promenade. Yet, for those who wished to advance further, the excursion did not halt there. Like other royal gardens of Isfahan, the Hazar Jarib too was accessible to the public, and its central walkway was conceived and perceived as an extension of the Chaharbagh. The Hazar Jarib garden featured an elaborate two-story central pavilion and two pairs of kiosks that flanked octagonal pools. The most remarkable edifice of the Hazar Jarib garden, however, was the pavilion that stood at its southern threshold. Camphor rendered this pavilion in frontal view at the end of the central walkway, commanding the terraced central axis of the garden on one side and facing the mountains on the other. The pavilion afforded a sweeping view of the Hazar Jarib, the Chaharbagh, and the cityscape of Isfahan beyond. Camphor's rendition suggests that the architecture of the pavilion on the southern threshold of the Hazar Jarib garden, and particularly its upper Avon, closely resembled that of the Jahan-nama, providing a counterpart for the edifice that defined the entrance to the Chaharbagh. Like the concluding rhyme of a poem, here the promenade came to a closure by circling back to its initiatory verse. Gazing down at the charbagh from the rooftop of the ultimate pavilion of the Hazar Jarib garden, the observer could discern an immense designed landscape laid out with a pronounced sense of mathematical precision. Greenery and water were subordinated to a grand geometric order, as were the facing pavilions that were harmoniously combined with the opener spaces that lay between them. Integrating physical and natural elements, this modular framework was fundamental to the creation of the sense of a uniform space. Rhythm was another key factor that informed the visitor's visual experience on the Chaharbagh, like the recurring refrains of a poem, the repetition of architectural and landscape arrangements, the rhythmic reappearance of pavilions, pools, and arcades in analogous configurations induced a sense of harmony that was appreciated over time by moving bodies. Yet, while bilateral symmetry was observed in individual edifices, the facing elements of the promenade were rarely mirror images of each other. Rather, they were ideally conceived as counterparts, as evident in pairings such as the throne and tents, coffee houses and taverns, opposing Sufi groups, and birds and beasts. The balance of opposites, rather than full parity, was construed as the ultimate source of harmony in urban design. And this is an aesthetic that has parallels in verbal and visual arts of the time. The sequence of paired structures rendered the charbagh an ideal setting for ceremonial and carnivalesque processions. On such occasions, the royal retinue would temporarily sojourn in the Hazar Jarib garden before the proper time arrived and the public parade was arranged. But the charbagh was not solely or primarily designed for such ceremonial uses. The social establishments and sensuous elements of the promenade, painted tiles, coffee houses, dervishes, breezes flowing through the arcades of the bridge, singing birds, fragrant flowers, they all enticed slow and leisurely movement to discern and consume its multisensory enchantments. In its overall urban design, the charbagh struck a delicate balance between a grand setting for ceremonial processions and an enticing public arena for recreational ambles. The weekly strolls of Isfahani women represents just one example of myriad new urban experiences that the grand promenade of the Safavid capital enabled and harbored. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farshid. This was fantastic. What a treat to be walked. You held our hands and walked us from one end of the Chaharbagh to the other, which was full of the sort of intense and extremely tangible sense of experience of sounds and smells and vistas, the optical, the oral, the olfactory, really multi-sensory approaches, which articulates the way you are really looking at Isfahan in your new book in a way that presents us with new ways of thinking about Isfahan as well. I really, really enjoyed your presentation. The images, the persuasive sense of the integration of the visual, the spatial, and the verbal, as it were, the textual, as resources come together in this reading of the promenade. I can't wait to read the book to see what else happens across other parts of the city. So I am waiting to see any questions that come. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us. And I'm sure you both enjoyed and have some important questions to pose to Farshid. I take advantage of this moment while we are waiting. There are at least one question that I can pose for you from the audience, but before I do so, you made a really interesting point at the end when you reach Hazar Jarib, turn around and look from the upper story of the pavilion, which I assume, and I think I heard you correctly, that was private to Chaharbagh and entourage. It wasn't the public stage. Am I right?
I mean, the idea is that, I mean, Pietro della Valle, other travelers, all emphasize that these gardens were typically open to the public. Unless the Shah was in residence in the Hazar Jarib garden, people could go inside.
Okay. So that
So
top floor was, in other words, no vista was preserved for the royal eye, so to speak.
that would be my claim based on the sources, although it was primarily intended for the royal retinue, but it was accessible to the public.
Okay. It's really interesting, that part. You can see where I'm going with that one, which is with that particular garden. The rest of them clearly laid out for the public use, unless, of course, it was Uruk and only the women were there, or if the Shah was there. But that really sets it apart in the sense that the gardens are ordinarily in these imperial layouts preserved for the royal glance or gaze, as the sort of terminology of the 80s and 90s might bring it. Like the miradors. The miradors were very exclusive, actually. And this would set it apart, especially in the gardens, not necessarily in the Maidan part, but certainly in the Chaharbagh part. And can you think of any comparatives that would allow for the public viewing stage through such means as the promenade, end of the promenade in the Hazar Jarib, so you could turn around, literally turn around and see the whole scheme, actually? Can you think of anything comparable?
Thanks so much for the question. So I want to make sure I understood it correctly. Is it other parallels in Isfahan or in other parts of the world?
No, in other parts. I mean, this is a really extraordinary thing to think that royal scheme of urban development allows for that sort of stage of viewing for the public.
Yeah, it was definitely very, it seems to be very unique. We know that, and that's a good question, like Versailles was also open to the public, but we don't know that the public was also available to share in the royal gaze. So you're right, I didn't think about it that way, but that's definitely very unique to Isfahan. And it's interesting because under Shah Suleiman, they built yet another viewing pavilion, because they wanted to not just capture the entire city, because the city over the 17th century grew larger, so they wanted to have a fuller panoramic view, so they even built another viewing station. So, and that was also open to the public. Is a Baume Isfahan, the roof of Isfahan, was just a place for panoramic viewing. And that view is very nicely described. I don't know if you remember that passage from Thomas Herbert, who visited, and he talks about that view of being able to, going on the top floor of the pavilion in the Hazar Jarib and sort of seeing all the not only the garden, but the cityscape and the charbagh.
Yeah, it's really an extraordinary example. And the Versailles, I think, if I correctly remember, it really is setting itself apart. It's a later moment when it becomes more accessible. It's really this desire to be away from the public, to build it so far away from the city, I mean, the capital, as it were. So in many ways, this is worth underscoring, it seems to me. So I'm gonna reserve more questions for another time or a later time. I have a ton of them, but for the moment, I want to turn to some of the questions that have come here for a lot of appreciation for your presentations. But let me pick one that says, and the image of the mint that comes in Campfire, for instance, which comes from Mrs. Sudover. Do you know where it was located? It's not related to this. It's in the Maidan, isn't it? The mint.
Right. The mint is in the Qaisariya,
Yeah.
on the north side of the Maidan.
Exactly. Yeah. So a question has come from Upmanu, who is one of my students. He says, you said that the two sides of the Chaharbagh divided by the river were designed differently, with one end with more aristocratic architectural presence. It's really this notion of the elite in one segment and the more public in the other one. If he asks if that created a difference in social mobility amongst the different classes of the city. Did people favor one end over another based on their class and status? So in other words, does it change the experience, the physical experience of the city because one section is more aristocratic than the other section?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. These two, I mean, that's one of the issues I wanted to sort of highlight in my study, that these two portions were of different characters. Because some of the sources describe speak very generally about the character of the charbagh. There were these generals who built gardens and pavilions, but they were all located on the south portion. So what is so definitely there were, on the north side you had the coffee houses, you had the taverns, you had the pastry shops, you had the Sufi convents. So it was by program a more active, lively social experience. But overall, what is interesting, and Professor Babai can comment on that, it seems that in Isfahan all places were democratically available to everyone. But that doesn't mean that social differences disappeared. Rather, social differences found new expressions. So the sources talk about upper class of Isfahan going to the coffee houses while there are attendants and with them, I mean, riding on horses. They are definitely dressed in more fashionable, luxurious dresses. So everybody's in this space, but the type of social expression of wealth and status is shifting and in changing. And it's very much, those expressions are very much intertwined with these changing urban spaces.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I agree with you. And I think I wouldn't use democratic because it's anachronistic.
Right, yeah.
We all
quote unquote democratic,
in
right?
scare quotes, definitely
Yeah.
scare quotes. But I totally agree with you in the sense that the very fact that Isfahan is laid out and designed to provide space for leisurely activity to the entire public, that you have gardens and promenades, that, you know, I have for years I've been teaching a course called Strolling Isfahan. You really have a strolling possibility in this city in ways that distinguish it from many other cities. Perhaps the next best example in the vicinity would be Jahan-nama, which is inspired, in fact, by this idea. But to have those spaces that you're talking about, the tavern and the coffee house and the gardens being open to the public, are quite transformative in terms of, first, what you build. So you build it for the use of the public. The very act of building for public purposes is itself really extraordinary, it seems to me. So I too agree with you on that one. So there's a question about, this is specific to the tiles. You make a really interesting case about those tiles, and the tiles comes from Maggie Squires, whom you know, and is finishing her PhD, thankfully, very soon, and works on the question of architecture and carpets. So here you are with architecture and the tiles, and we know that murals were also related to the buildings and the vistas and what you see, what you don't see. And does it really require, then, she says, that these tiles, the way they are represented in the museums, that we begin to rethink it? Is that something that you can, how they are shown in museums? Does your research help change things?
Sure. Yeah, I hope. Yeah, these are there are curatorial decisions that need to be taken, and knowing where they come from. So one, there is this very old cliche about Islamic art that wherever you see figural imagery, it should have been in a secluded place. That's not true. That hasn't been true. That's definitely not true about
Yeah.
Isfahan. So I mean, these were definitely public, and they were part of the experience of the city. And this is known to us who are working on Isfahan. But there is sometimes you see the cliche resurfacing in labels in museums that this is an exception, and then they need to explain the exception. Say no, this was in a private palace of the king, and we do, but I mean that's not true.
That's
So
right.
that's one point that needs to be it's communicated to the public in museum settings. And the cupbearer that I showed, it was just it was in a private collection. Then it was dedicated to the Smith College Museum of Art. So it was until 4 years ago, nobody knew that this piece of the Jahan-nama was also existed. So and then there are opportunities for virtual exhibitions, right? And a lot of colleagues are working on these projects, putting them all back together, reconstructing them.
Yeah. Yeah, and
These are
it's interesting because what you're saying is that, and it's really important, is that the sort of assumptions about what is considered to be a Muslim context, the separations, the distances, the privacy, the haram as being a particularly distinctive space, those are not to be discounted, but also not so tight separation that you won't see paintings of more racy nature in public, which we know are indeed in public. So there is something related to that, a question from Caroline, who says, am I right that those buildings on the southern pavilions were a little slower than Abbas intended? I thought the Jahan-nama was preserved for royal women, so the portraits covered with slats or similar kinds of arrangements so that they would allow women to look out and men not to look in, so to speak. In other words, this male-female gazing and access, visual access. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. So the first question, the charbagh was inaugurated in 1602, according to Yazdi. But I mean, building all those monuments definitely took more time. So it was the project was going on, and it seems that the southern portion, the northern portion, was inaugurated earlier than the rest. So the construction was going on for at least 2 decades. That's my estimate. And regarding the Jahan-nama, so this is what Chardin says, and I think he's wrong. And I mean, such an important building cannot be just solely for the use of women. I mean, this is also highlighted by Suzanne, that this is just an analog to the Ali Kapu. This is the second gate of the palace complex. There's one gate on the Maidan. There's one gate on this is a 3-story building. This is the vestibule for entering the palace complex, because it's on the other side of the palace Dolat Khane, which contains the haram. So it was definitely more closely associated with women. But to assume that it was solely meant for women, and I know several colleagues would not agree with that, but I think, I mean, Chardin is a proto-Orientalist in writing in early 17th century, and sort of going into very much, this is the beginning of sort of European obsession with the harem, and this is just women and that kind of separation. So I think that's so that's not correct. It cannot be just it was definitely, I would say, not intended for women alone when it was constructed under Shah Abbas the First. But maybe in the late 17th century was primarily used by women. That's the source of what Chardin says.
Yeah. So that's a really tough thing, right? Denying Chardin the authority. It's a
I mean he's wrong. I mean so I mean I give just one example. I mean it's just there's the tent garden, and the tent garden he translated as garden of the donkey because khar means donkey, but khargah is an entirely different word. So we are here dealing with a person who feels so confident about his knowledge of Persian, I mean, which is definitely not perfect, but I mean then passing all and sharing all these judgments. But Kampfer, who did all those drawings, is much more objective. I know objectivity is a difficult issue, but I mean, because we have several sources, so we can compare them with one another and see, okay, here Chardin is definitely wrong, and there are many more examples.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the khargah is a good one because Kempfer's use of Latin means that he will have to come up with terms that are meaningfully attached to these buildings. And it's really useful to think about the terminology in comparative terms. It really makes a huge difference in understanding what the Europeans see and ask for. There are several other questions here, and I wonder if I could ask, just pose to you. I think Tim Stanley is making a comment that Saudat Abad Palace and Gardens in Istanbul bear strong similarities to the Chaharbagh. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
This is not my specialty, but I know in the poetic descriptions of Sadabad, it's compared to the Chaharbagh. So there is a sense they were definitely aware of it. It's a century after the building of the Chaharbagh, so it could have been. But I mean, we don't have the evidence of we were inspired by. We see the sense of rivalry both with Shah Jahan-abad, as Susan mentioned, and Sadabad.
Yeah, and but this is never about one influences the other. It's about ideas that are floating at the same time around, around the experience of urban developments and gardens and so forth. I totally agree with you. I'm not at all interested in showing who has been first. Just as Europeans aren't the first to do any of this stuff, as we all now know very well indeed. I'm looking at the shorter questions, but you can pick something. Lindsay Allen, if I correctly understand, it is Lindsay, asks if there is a connected, perhaps any relevance of New Jolfa to this, the Upper Chaharbagh, which is south of the river, actually. Are there any connections?
That's a good question. I see it. I mean, right. I mean, so there is the four-quartered city, and there's this perfect, almost perfect cross shaped by the Charbagh and the river. So it's a sort of a definitely an intention of creating these quarters through that cross-axial arrangement. Sorry, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but yeah, there was a Charbagh, but there was a Zoroastrian neighborhood, but so that kind of oppositional facing on the other side, sort of so it's a kind of arrangement like that is like the arrangement of the pavilions, two dervish groups facing one another, two minority groups facing one another. So there is at that level of design, I see a parallel. I'm not sure if the dedication of the gardens on the soft portion of the Charbagh to bureaucratic and military elites I haven't thought about any connection to Jolfa.
Yeah, okay. One of my students, Fatima, is asking if you can speak a little bit more about the soundscape. I think this particularly is interested to some of my students. We look at the ways in which these experiential encounters take place. So the nightingales, is it deliberately bringing nightingales in that garden? Are there particular sort of deliberate actions or decisions that would enhance or create soundscapes, specific soundscapes? I imagine the water, sound of the water is part of it all along. But are there some other ways you can think of it?
Oh, great. I mean, the Nightingale Garden, I feel it was deliberate. I mean, and the other side, not opposite the Nightingale, there's a sweet smelling garden. So there's a olfactory, oral. I mean, those are some suggestions that this was deliberate. There were other sounds. There was the sound of the chatter of the coffee house. And
Yes.
and the music coming. I mean, Shamsa Tishi was a musician. He composed music. I mean, if you wanted to hear the latest songs composed by this, master musician of early 17th century, you would go to the tavern or the coffee house on the Chaharbagh. And there's definitely, as Susan said, the sound of water. These cascades, these carved stone cascades, were meant to, accelerate evaporation of water, but also create that kind of pleasant sound of water flowing. And that's coming from garden design, but that's definitely a deliberate element of garden design that is incorporated into this urban space.
Yeah, there is a question here about your point about carnivalesque or the processionals and ceremonials. You're not talking about processionals in the Chaharbagh, or are you? That would be with sort of organized the way we hear from, for instance, the Esterbal, the welcoming of someone like the is it Wali Muhammad Khan as he arrives in Isfahan, and he's brought in with all these interesting machines that they weave a cloth or do all kinds of acrobatics with it. Is that what you're talking about? The question is really about whether public participates in it. How is it performed? The theatricality, the way Babak Rahimi talks about the Maidan, for instance.
Thank you for the question. It's exactly the same kind of practice. I didn't have time to go into it, but I discuss it in the book a little bit further, not very extensively. We know of at least two major processions that were held on the Charbagh. One was for Shah Abbas when he returned from the conquest of Baghdad in 1624. And then this is based on the Russian traveler Kotov's description of a carnivalesque kind of procession. There's another one a little bit more extensive from the reign of Shah Safi, early in his reign, that it's clearly described that the royal retinue, Shah Safi, returns to Isfahan. And the royal retinue is stationed in the Hazar Jarib garden. A procession is organized. All people are coming to the Charbagh to view the procession of the Shah from the garden to the palace complex. Cannons were meant to sort of fire cannons at the bridge when Shah Safi reached the bridge. But I mean, the chronicler says that the cannons didn't work, but I mean, the intention was there. So I mean, so it was sort of a very kind of a space that was used for these kinds of planned processions. And that was, I sort of hinted at it in my presentation, that the delicate balance, it's a space for sensory, multisensory experiences, but at the same time, it has a sense of grandeur and a rhythmic procession of the pavilions that is sort of, and those upper floor balconies could have been great for the kind of pageantry that accompanies these carnivalesque processions.
Yeah. So there's one question about Bogh-e-Takht, the question of throne. Is this really just a name, or why is it called Bogh-e-Takht? Is it someplace that indeed a throne would be placed, or some aspect of of a royal presence could be understood there?
Thank you. That's a great question. We don't know much about it. I feel it was modeled after the famous Bagh-e-Takht that existed in Shiraz. So a lot of these garden types existed in Persian architecture, garden design, and then they were adopted and adapted. So what's happening is that, and it's in Isfahan, is that that model is taken and then it's sort of incorporated in the broader building program of the Chaharbagh. There was no actual throne, but there was a reference to the Bagh-e-Takht of Shiraz, and the pavilion that existed on the Bagh-e-Takht sort of is similar to the one that existed in the Bagh-e-Takht of Shiraz. So that kind of connection, sort of going back to these models and reinterpreting them for the context of Islam.
Yeah, there is another question that has to do with the sweeping views, and Rachel Alban is asking whether the experience of the Chaharbagh was more around, one's own location on the Chaharbagh, or that kind of sweeping view. How often is this part of the experience, or is this something that is you standing above? I'm adding to it. She's not saying it. I'm just asking you that. You standing above that, you're looking at it from a bird's eye view, with the knowledge of an architect, unpacking the whole thing and repositioning it, reconstructing, is the experience of this grand vista of everyone's, or is it more fragmented or can you think about how these two relate to one another?
Those are excellent questions. So this is sort of the existence of these two vistas is one of the sub-themes of my book. I discuss it in different parts. There is the metaphorical panoptic gaze, the gaze of the planner, who's the Shah and the royal architects and the advisors, whoever, and courtiers. But there's another view, but both views are designed, and both views could have been appropriated by people. So on the Chaharbagh and in Isfahan in general, we don't have much in terms of topographical features. So, I mean, a good comparison is Istanbul with the hilly landscape. So that kind of landscape provides other opportunities for designing vistas. In Isfahan, most of the vistas are designed because you don't have much in terms of topographical features. There's the river, and then you go through the Charbagh. It is the very circumscribed view. Then you enter the main passageway, but then you have the panoramic view from the galleries. And then there is again the circumscribed vision, but you get to the Hazar Jarib garden. It's a sloping ground. You go higher and higher, and then you reach the pavilion. Then there's the opportunity to engage in that. So there's the actual physical experience of different vistas, panoramic and circumscribed, but also they have metaphorical associations, right, with planning, and I think, I mean, there was definitely a sense of enjoying and appreciating the grand plan, the mathematical precision, the grid. I mean, that was also needed to be appreciated. They wanted to appreciate, they wanted to see the city from above and also from below.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's obviously I love Isfahan, I know Susan. I mean, these are, I mean, great. I mean, these are design strategies. I think they are deliberate. They're part of the design of Isfahan, urban design.
Yeah, without a doubt, both of us think that is very
great. Yeah.
And it's very great. There was a question actually about whether there is a relationship between this kind of design and thinking and a kind of a divine mathematical superimposition, something that would make it more along the lines of the a religious, if you will, or a spiritual mathematics.
Okay, that's a great question. So I personally, I mean, in terms of whether there is so there is this sort of several studies of Isfahan that put emphasis on doctrinal aspects of Safavid society, and that's part of it. And there is also the idea that Neoplatonic idea, and that's definitely true. These in the philosophical school of Isfahan, these
Right.
Neoplatonic ideas were revived by figures like Sheikh Baha'i, Mir Damad, and others. I wanted to be very earthly in my study. So, but I'm not dismissing that question. Those are important venues of inquiry, but I kind of try to see the actual physical bodily experience of everything, mathematical planning or bodily experience of the city. And I put it aside for research purposes. I'm not saying that's not important. So
Yeah, I
I
mean,
don't know, and those are more difficult to answer, right?
yeah, it's very hard to, it's hard to actually grab onto. It's the evidence, the sacred geometry, which is so profoundly significant to some who study Islamic art, Islamic everything. There is no Islamic city, in my view, and therefore this is not about Islam, and sacred geometry from that angle will need another venue for discussion. I too agree with you on that one. I'm going to take one more question, if I may just throw it at you, because it's an important question, but I think it needs to be addressed. Sohail says, do we know enough about the design of the, or the layout of the Seljuk Isfahan to know whether it had any kind of impact, inspiration for the new Isfahan?
Yeah, that's an important question. There's we don't have the evidence. We know we have the textual evidence, right? We know there were gardens. I mean, some of these gardens, there were gardens, royal gardens in the environs of Isfahan during the Seljuk period. You're absolutely right. How those gardens impacted the layout of Isfahan under the Safavids, I don't know. I haven't encountered any evidence of maybe the Saodatabad garden or the Khajubra promenade, which was built in the mid-17th century, was sort of built on the site of Seljuk gardens. But I'm not sure about the Chaharbagh. We don't know.
Yeah.
I think I don't know. Maybe there's evidence discovered later.
Yeah, if I correctly remember, the Seljuk walls are farther north. In other words, Isfahan, New Isfahan comes south of the old Seljuk garden walls, and the gardens were along the river. In other words, at a distance from the city. So the city planning, the way we understand Isfahan being planned in this very holistic fashion. You only talked about Chaharbagh, but you could have just as well, and the book does too, look also at the rest of Isfahan as part of the integrated grand sort of what I like to think of it as a master plan. And so it's a very different kind of a city, and it's very much an early modern city in many ways, I think. So it's good to, it's not just that we don't know enough, maybe, but that it's a very different conception of the city. Medieval Seljuk city is very differently understood. It must be, it ought to be.
Sure, definitely. Yeah. I mean, but on that, I definitely agree. But there is also the possibility that some of these gardens that existed on the river banks were sort of transformed into, revived under the, that's a possibility, definitely. But the conception of the city, you're absolutely right. It was very different.
Yeah. So a lot of praise for you, Farshid. I think we have
Thank
come
you.
to the end of our time. We should give you time to have a glass of water. I thank you very much. I'm sorry that at this point we couldn't bring you to London, but I really appreciate you giving us the time, while I'm sure it is still ongoing teaching and other duties, and I look forward to reading the book. And I know that my students who are all here saying how much they have enjoyed reading your book
Thank
and
you.
articles shall carry on. And I thank you very much once again. Thank you to the audience who has been so involved and active and present, and look forward to seeing you again, Farshid, and cooking up some other things, such as a conference panel together.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for being here, for all the questions. Thank you, Susan, for the invitation.
A pleasure, really. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye,
Bye.
Farshid.